So, welcome everybody. Can you hear? Okay. Everybody here all right? All right. So, welcome to our wonderful program this afternoon. My pleasure to introduce to you.
Louder. I think louder.
Louder. Really?
Get the mic closer.
Okay, louder. All right. So, we're delighted to have Bill Green with us today. As most of you know, he was the state archaeologist of Iowa. Is that the way I say that? For 20-some years? Almost 20 years.
14 years.
Oh, my math is not very good. I'm sorry. 14 years. After which...
Seemed like 27.
Oh, okay. All right. So, after which he went to Beloit to the Logan School of Anthropology.
Museum.
Logan Museum of Anthropology. All right. And I just wanted to thank also, and I don't see him here today, I wanted to thank the Wentworth family for sponsoring this program in memory of Bill Wentworth, who was such an outdoorsman and so into things of this type. He would have loved to have been here. So thank you to them for that. I have to tell you one funny little story, tell Bill one funny little story. I may never forgive him for this program because evidently in the anthropology, archaeology world, there's a very distinguished person by the name of Bonnie Mitchell. And since word got out that we were having this program, I have been getting, and this is not an exaggeration, I have been getting dozens, maybe even hundreds of emails and notices from people who think I'm that Bonnie Mitchell. They're sending me studies about caves that they've in all kinds of things. And I just think it needs to stop. Anyway, I'm just so delighted that we're having this program. It's such an important thing to Jackson County. I'm glad to see all the Seeberger family here, and it's just wonderful. So thank you all for coming, and we'll turn the time over to Bill Green.
Thanks, Bonnie. After this talk, you will be the expert. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm going to try to stick to my script because I tend to get distracted and go off on tangents. So I will be reading a few things, but I'll be happy to entertain questions or comments afterward. I don't promise any answers, but like I said, I'll entertain the questions. I'm glad to be back here in Iowa and to share some of the work that has united my two recent career paths, my Iowa and my Wisconsin career paths. So I want to thank Bonnie, the Historical Society, for inviting me to give the program. And I want to thank the other members of the research team, the small but efficient and dynamic research team that helped me on this project, Cherie Howry Arts and Chad Heinzel. Special thanks to Stephanie Weeks for allowing us onto the property and helping us with our work, and to Dirk and Sam Marcucci for showing me around today at some wonderful sites here in Jackson County. Now, as you may know, archaeologists have investigated dozens of rock shelters and caves in eastern Iowa. And if you have any doubt about that, just look at the display case over there or the big posters over there, and you can see there's been over 100 years worth of excavation of Jackson County and other eastern Iowa caves and rock shelters. But only one site, Seeberger Cave, was excavated as a result of a radio program about the French Paleolithic. Without that broadcast, the site would not have been excavated, at least not by Paul Nesbitt, a young man who would later do archaeology in France, Algeria, and New Mexico, and would become a museum director, a military intelligence officer, and the founding chairman of the University of Alabama Department of Anthropology. But Jackson County was his first ever dig. And so today I want to introduce you to the site, the people involved in this dig back in 1926, and the finds that they made. I'll also talk a little about the site's importance for understanding ancient people and their relationships to the natural world and the spirit world. Now, we understand nature and spirit as generally two different things, but that distinction has not always necessarily existed. Now, some of my slides here did not survive the transfer from one computer to the other. All this one shows you is where the cave is located. It's very simple. You go up 61, about 6 miles, you take a left for about 1.5 miles, and there you are. All right? So you don't need any more specifics than that. So, but it's located on the North Fork Maquoketa River, about 6 miles north of here, one of hundreds of caves and rock shelters throughout Jackson County and the nearby counties. For thousands of years, this part of Iowa supported deciduous forests, oak savannas, which are open oak forests, and tall grass prairies. Forest and open oak forests dominated in this vicinity. But during the Ice Age and immediately afterwards, the local woodlands were mostly spruce, fir, and pine, which don't grow naturally in the area now. These all disappeared from Jackson County about 9,000 years ago. But one thing that makes Seeberger Cave interesting is its cast of characters. And so I want to introduce you to 3 of the main individuals involved: Frank Ellis, George Colley, and Paul Nesbitt. So here's Frank. He and his father, James Ellis, were well-known Jackson County figures. Both were elected to the state legislature, and both ran private museums in Maquoketa. James wrote the definitive 2-volume history of Jackson County in 1910. I was going to ask if there's a copy handy in the room. There must be somewhere. 2-volume history of Jackson County. So Frank's father, James, wrote that in 1910. Now, Frank himself became a widely respected conservationist. He was instrumental in establishing Maquoketa Cave State Park. He was so beloved locally that upon his death in 1941, Maquoketa businesses closed and schools were dismissed so students could attend the funeral en masse. Now, Frank ran successful real estate and insurance businesses, but nothing he did matched the effort, dedication, and passion he devoted to archaeology. He and his son Francis excavated many caves and rock shelters in Jackson County, stocking his museum with thousands of artifacts and bones. So this was his museum. It's been torn down. I think I saw on one of the county history Facebook posts a photo of the interior of the museum. Is anyone familiar with that? I'd really love to see that if someone has a copy handy. But, so this is his private museum. He said in 1926, this is what he said about himself: "I have the archaeology bug bad." And probably a couple of other people in this room could say the same thing. So one of his legacies was to inspire the young Paul Seeberger to pursue an interest in archaeology, the result being the Seeberger Museum, which would be the 3rd private archaeology museum in the area. And of course, Paul Seeberger was responsible for well-documented collections from numerous sites in eastern Iowa. So that's our first character, that's Frank. Our second character is George Colley. He's in the middle of this photo. Is anyone here familiar with the guy on the left, Roy Chapman Andrews? Does that name ring a bell? Yeah. How about the book All About Dinosaurs from the 1940s and 50s? How about the inspiration for the character Indiana Jones? That was Roy Chapman Andrews. So, but George Colley in the middle. He was a geologist by training, and late in his life he became an archaeologist. He was born, raised, and employed in southern Wisconsin, spending his entire career at Beloit College, which, if you don't know, is right on the Wisconsin-Illinois state line. Except for a few years he spent at Harvard University, where he earned his geology PhD. He became director of Beloit College's Logan Museum by the early 1920s, and was overseeing a dynamic acquisition program for the museum. He built global collections through purchases, exchanges, and archaeological expeditions in much of North America, and to great acclaim by 7 years of intensive field work in North Africa and Western Europe, 1924 through 1930. Now, Colley's research and that of his protege Alonzo Pond, who is on the right-hand side here, they focused on the origins of modern humans and early cultures. They thought humans evolved in Africa, which was a pretty revolutionary thought for much of the 1920s. And so he and Pond excavated numerous sites in Algeria and France to test that theory. They focused on caves with deep deposits that might show how ancient cultures and technologies changed over time. But they couldn't always get permission to dig, though, especially in France. It was a little dicey year to year. So Colley kept his eye out for local possibilities to train students. Sorry about that picture, but you'll see him. and Paul Nesbitt was one of his students, so he's our third main character. He was born not far from here in Savannah, Illinois, straight east. He graduated from Beloit College in 1926. He was the college's star track athlete, but he wanted to be an archaeologist. So Colley wanted him to work in France or Algeria, but he knew that Nesbitt needed training, and he also saw that his options to work overseas in 1926 fell through. So that's why Nesbitt spent the summer working in Jackson County, and I'll get to that story in a few minutes. Oh, lost that one too, sorry. So picture a college boy, a senior, his yearbook picture, just a really well, just a nice college boy. If you can imagine a guy, a graduation picture from 1926. That's Paul Nesbitt. So, he was here in 1926. Afterward, his career took off. He did excavate in France and Algeria. He succeeded Colley as director of the Logan Museum. He earned a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. And as I said, he ran archaeology projects in New Mexico and elsewhere. Now, during World War II, and again, I'm sorry this didn't come out, he resigned from Beloit to take commissions with the Air Force Intelligence Office and the Office of Strategic Services. What was the Office of Strategic Services? The forerunner of the CIA. Exactly right, thank you. The CIA. After the war, he worked at the National Museum of Guatemala, and then he returned to military intelligence at Maxwell Air Force Base, and as I said, ended his career at the University of Alabama. He founded the university's anthropology department. I did get his service records from the National Archives. They're not secret, even though the picture didn't come through. So, how did these three characters come together at Seeberger Cave? It goes back to the radio broadcast I mentioned at the start. Friday, February 19th, 1926, Colley delivered a talk about the Logan Museum's archaeological work in France and Algeria to Beloit College's Chicago Alumni Association at the Hotel LaSalle. Chicago radio station WMAQ was located in that hotel and broadcast the event live. You can't listen to WMAQ anymore because about 20 years ago they turned to WSCR and it's all sports now. Anyway, Ellis heard part of that broadcast and he wrote a letter to Colley the next day. Dear Doctor, last night I heard part of your very interesting lecture from station WMAQ in Chicago by means of my radio. So, he invited Colley to visit Jackson County. He said, why go overseas to study ancient man? We can produce as good specimens from primitive man as any other part of the globe. And he also said that thorough research should be done over here before crossing the pond. Take care of the local material first, as the rapid settlement of this country is rapidly spoiling the opportunities for getting the lost story. So this attitude brings two of Ellis's viewpoints together. He was the archaeology bug, but he was also the conservationist. He wanted to learn about the ancient past, but he also wanted to study sites before they disappeared or before people wasted time in Europe doing what they could do here instead. So, Colley was grateful for Ellis's interest, eager to learn more about the Iowa sites and see them for himself. The timing was good because he was unsure whether further work would be possible in Algeria, and he knew he needed trained helpers for his work in France in 1927 and beyond. Where was he to find experienced help? Ellis and Iowa offered the answer. Colley accepted Ellis's invitation and visited here less than 2 weeks after learning about the Jackson County caves. So, Friday, March 5th, 1926, Colley took the train from Beloit to Maquoketa via Delmar. Ellis met him at the Maquoketa depot, and they went directly to Frank's office to view his collection and talk archaeology. Some of my favorite parts of the Seeberger cave story are the details that Colley recorded about this trip in his diary. It's not easy to read, but it's a lot of fun once you get into it. You don't try to read it. All right, that first night in Maquoketa, Colley had to sleep in a very cold room in the Ellis home. Conditions the following day were also unpleasant. When it wasn't raining, it was snowing. Frank and George went out in the ford a ways and then tramped over hills to visit caves. Got very wet, bad walking, and hard time with ice on hilltop. We've been there. George returned to the Ellises for dinner and maybe a short rest before going back to town to talk to the local Isaac Walton League about the bow and arrow, the development of the bow and arrow. Although there was a very good crowd, the rest of the evening continued the day's downward spiral. Colley reported that the ford went to pieces in an accident, forcing Colley and Ellis to walk a mile and a half in a storm. Sunday morning was even worse. George waking to a furious wind and much colder. The pair had to take a taxi to visit some cave sites, another trek that could not have been pleasant. After dinner, Colley took a taxi to the Delmar depot, bad fortune dogging him yet again as his valise came apart and a woman accused him of staring at her. He must have been quite relieved when the train finally delivered him to Beloit at 9:15, even to a cold house with no food. Speaking of food. Ever the gentleman, Colley thanked Ellis for the pleasant and profitable weekend he had spent in Iowa. Despite the personal discomforts, he had confirmed the archaeological significance of the cave finds and identified 2 sites for possible excavation. The day after he returned, 3 of his students expressed an interest in digging in Iowa. Pond was due back that spring from his 10-month Algerian expedition and could teach field methods to those students. With the 1926 field school in France canceled, Colley began planning for the 4 Beloit students to dig in Iowa. The cave was owned at that time by the Farmers Trust and Savings Bank of Maquoketa. Ellis arranged for the bank's cashier to issue a permit for the excavation. The permit would be short-term but renewable because the bank wished to sell the land. Now, Colley originally believed his former student Alonzo Pond and the other 3 students ought to be able to complete the excavation in 2 weeks, which is one reason Colley was amenable to the short-term lease plan. But in the event, the crew would comprise just Pond, and just for a few days, and the newly graduated Paul Nesbitt. The other 2 students disappeared. Colley told Pond to show excavation methods to Nesbitt and then to leave him to carry on the work until the site was excavated. Now, spending just a couple of days on site was fine with Pond because he was getting married in a few weeks and preparing to spend the next year or so back in Europe on honeymoon and in Africa doing field work. The plan was good for Nesbitt too. He had an entire archaeological site essentially to himself for the summer. He would receive field training from an acknowledged expert, Pond, and he would be paid a decent wage for a novice, $4 a day in 1926, not bad. He would also be enrolling in graduate school that fall with the prospect of a potential thesis project in France. Plus, his site was only 40 miles from his home in Savannah, Illinois. On the right-hand side was just a typewritten report. But Nesbitt and Pond began working at Seeberger Cave on June 26, 1926. This is when the problems began. Well, the problems started earlier for Colley. This is when the problems for Nesbitt began. Despite having learned basic methods from Pond, Nesbitt recorded almost nothing about his work. We have no diary, no field notes or photos, no maps showing the excavated trenches or features, and no original inventory of the finds. We don't know how Nesbitt decided what items to keep and what to discard or leave on site. He dug for 10 weeks, yet all he produced was one map of the cave, which is what you see here, and a 5.5-page summary report. And contrast that with what Paul Sagers was doing a little bit later, documenting the sites, documenting the finds, and making it useful for research 100 years later. So, yes, it was 99 years ago, and we can cut Nesbitt a little slack. This is not how caves should be documented, and they kind of knew it at the time. Still, his short report has some small nuggets of information. He recorded that he dug through several layers. He dug a long trench and 2 other places in the cave floor to a depth of about 30 inches. The artifacts that he retained survived mostly untouched in the Logan Museum, so that was a good thing. Even better, some of them were labeled in ink with letters and numbers that might indicate where in the cave or how deep Nesbitt found them. So all was not lost, even though it took us a while to figure out what these letters and numbers meant. Another good thing, sounds strange to say, but nobody paid any attention to this collection until 2003, which is when I started working with it. So it had remained pretty much intact since the time Nesbitt shipped it to Beloit. A lot of other collections that people made in the 1920s were used for classroom purposes and were dispersed in one way or another, but this collection remained pretty much intact. The collection was neglected. The dig itself was essentially forgotten. Nesbitt, who went on to that illustrious career, didn't even list it on his professional resume. And Frank Ellis's archaeological exploits, it's sad to say, pretty much faded from memory, even in Makokata, especially because his museum collection was dispersed after his death. Again, in contrast with the Sagers collection, which was kept together. Well, let's look at the cave itself before we talk about what Nesbitt found. It's large by local standards. The south-facing entrance is about 32 feet wide and 6.5 to 8.5 feet high. The depth of the sheltered area is about 36 feet, and the total floor area is about 1,100 square feet. Here's the interior. Now, the ceiling height at the back is only about 4 feet, but it would have been higher in the past when the floor was lower. There's a fracture at the back of the cave that lets in some light and moisture, and you can see that in the right-hand corner at the back of the cave there. Now, when we visited 2 years ago, we didn't see any carvings or paintings on the wall, but that's not to say that they weren't there or they might be very faint. But rock carvings and rock paintings are very well preserved on sandstone, but not on limestone or dolomite, which is what this cave is. Oh, okay, back to Nesbitt's map. Essentially, the map that Nesbitt made was fairly accurate. He did spend some time on it, but like I said, everything he found in the cave, the depth of the cave, he did not map those. Now let's see if this video will come up. Here's a video Chad Heinzel, my colleague, made 2 years ago. Some cow patties in there from Stephanie's Longhorns. Pretty cool, huh? Oh, sorry. All right, I wanted to show you some of the artifacts from the cave. Unfortunately, the pictures did not make the transition between computers. But what I can tell you is that all of the artifacts that Nesbitt found in the cave are represented in the cases over here. Same kinds of artifacts. Let me give you a summary of what he found. All right? There were 372 pottery sherds, most of them about the size of a quarter or a little bigger. We call ancient pottery pieces sherds. We call glass pieces shards. I don't know why, but they're sherds. So most of the pottery is what we call middle or late woodland in age. That means it dates to between 100 and 1100 AD. Okay? And the clay was mixed with sand or grit before it was fired to help keep the pot together. And there's different kinds of decoration too, and you can see it on the examples here from the Seeberger's collection and from the rock shelter excavations that Dirk Marcucci did. Same kind of things. Some of them are decorated with cords, twisted cords impressed on the clay. Some of them are decorated with stamps, carved stamps, wooden stamps in the clay. Okay? Some of the pottery is tempered, mixed with shell instead of grit. And those would be a little more recent in time, maybe 1100 up to maybe 15 or 1600. Now in terms of stones, Nesbitt brought back 359 stone tools of various kinds. Most are broken pieces of manufacturing. That is, when you make a single stone tool, you end up with about 500 pieces of, the technical term is debitage, junk, all right? Flint, debris, flakes, chips, etc. So Nesbitt collected a lot of those, and there were a lot of broken stone tools also. And there were some projectile points, some spear points dating as far back as about 5000 BC, all the way up to after 1200 AD. So pretty much the full range of cultures from about the past 6,000 years in Jackson County. What you see here is one of the tools that Nesbitt did not collect. He left it on site. Stephanie said she was going to bring it here.
It's in my truck, but I did
Oh,
bring
okay.
pieces of the pottery.
Oh, good, good, good. Okay, we'll see those after we've been right. Can we pass them on later? Oh, yeah, we'll look at them later. Thank you. So you can probably guess that this was used as a grinding stone, but also maybe a nutting stone for smashing nuts and also doing some stone working as well. Okay. Now, Nesbitt also found some shells from Little Maquoketa River, from the North Fork Maquoketa, and about 250 bone specimens also. And they're all fragments, they're all smashed except for the back part of a baby bison skull. And what you see here, this is a living baby bison. But you can see how small that skull is, 12 centimeters, 5 inches. So this skull was retained in the collection, and it took an expert to figure out what exactly it was. The skull is from a late-term fetus or newborn bison, okay? And it compares very favorably in size to this bison. Okay. Again, just ignore the map on the left. So, what was the cave used for? Well, on the basis of all those stone tools and pottery, just like you can see in those cases, it was used for everyday domestic living purposes. They were hunting deer and other animals, processing them on site or near the site. They were eating in the site. They were cooking. They were discarding some of their refuse in the site. They were basically living there on a periodic basis over this span of maybe 6,000 years or so. But they were also doing other things. In the middle of his main trench, Nesbitt reported that he found a fireplace, 1.5 feet by 1 foot in size, so not huge, and it was a little over 2 feet deep, and it had a 3-inch thick layer of charcoal. And that charcoal was surrounded and underlain by burnt rocks. So, thank goodness he provided this amount of detail. This is about the only thing he provided any detail on. But the other good thing about this is that he actually kept some of the charcoal from that feature. Now, we wanted to figure out what it was. And it's possible, even with charcoal, you know how you can identify wood by snapping it open, looking at the grains and the pores? You can do the same with charcoal, too, if you know what you're doing. And when you put the charcoal under an electron microscope and jack it up 500 times, 5,000 times, you can really distinguish between different species of trees at a very fine level. And surprise, surprise, this charcoal, all of the pieces of charcoal, turned out to be balsam fir. Has anyone ever seen balsam fir growing in Jackson County? No, except in your living room corner at Christmas. Right? Okay, this must have been a prank, or people must have mixed things up in the lab, and clearly you could not have a fireplace in a cave at a depth of 2 feet. That's balsam fir. So the next step would be to figure out how old is this charcoal. So we submitted it for radiocarbon dating, and that's when the next shock occurred. It dates to around 300 AD. So it's not from a Christmas tree. It was not a prank. And every piece of wood in that collection from that feature, from that fireplace, were small bits of balsam fir. There was no other type of wood, and it was all from a young tree or branches or twigs. Okay. Why did native people 1,700 years ago build a fireplace in a cave, use only balsam fir wood, when the cave was surrounded by oaks and hickories and maples and elms, much better firewood? Well, sorry. As you may know, balsam fir is a boreal forest species. The only occurrence of balsam fir in Iowa is in the far northeast. You can actually visit in Alameda County. You can visit the Bluffton Fir Stand State Preserve, which is the best stand of naturally occurring balsam fir. But it is disjunct, which means that there are only little islands, little pockets of balsam fir in the northeast corner of Iowa. And it's not till you get to central Minnesota, central Wisconsin, that you begin to pick up balsam fir naturally living in forests in any abundance. Okay? So they pretty much obviously had to bring it to to the cave from some distance. Now, the balsam fir that does grow in northeast Iowa is often associated with algific talus slopes. Raise your hand if you've heard of algific talus slopes. Some, yeah, okay. Think of an ice cave. Think of a north-facing crevice where the water freezes in the winter, and then in the summer, when the air is blowing through the crevice, it brings that cold air out onto the landscape. And the air right around these algific talus slopes never gets to warm up more than about 50 degrees, even in the summer. Okay? So these places harbor boreal forest species. About 60 different plants and animals that live near these slopes don't live anywhere else in Iowa and only live in the boreal forest. So it's almost, the term that biologists use for them is a paleorefugium, okay? Paleo means old. Refugium means it's sort of a refuge for the snails and the plants that can't normally live this far south. It's too warm for them. But at the openings of these algific slopes, it's cool enough, the soil temperature stays cool, the air temperature stays cool, and they're able to survive. And that's often where balsam fir exists in northeast Iowa. Now, the map on the right, so that's kind of what the map on the left is showing you, is a cross-section of one of these algific slopes. And the map on the right shows that there are algific slopes in Jackson County and in the surrounding counties. But so far, nobody has documented any balsam fir growing naturally at these sites. It might have grown around these sites in the past, but it doesn't grow there now. So the people who were living at Seeberger Cave had a number of choices to make. They needed to use balsam fir for something, and we'll get to that in a minute. Where were they going to get it? They had to go to an algific slope nearby, if possible, but we don't even know if it was growing. Or they would have to go about 100 miles north into Clayton County and Alameda County, and then bring the twigs, the branches, the young wood back to the site. There it is. So again, that's what this charcoal feature in the middle of the cave consisted of. Young wood, twigs, branches from balsam fir. Okay. So let me tell you a little about balsam fir. Kind of shouting here. Balsam fir is not good for heating. Balsam fir is good, especially among Native people, for its medicinal, ritual, and spiritual value. Native people consider balsam fir a blessed plant. Its powers and abilities include purification, protection from harm, even reviving a dead person's spirit. Anishinaabe, the Ojibways, refer to balsam fir as elder sister. And another name for the tree is she stands at prayer for us, signifying that the tree holds the highest concern for her family and relatives. And the tree is a female, her family and relatives, because of her healing properties. At least 87 uses of balsam fir are documented among at least 12 native groups in eastern and central North America. Some of these uses involved close exposure of the plant to heat. Anishinaabe in northern Wisconsin and Minnesota placed balsam fir leaves, resin, and roots directly on live coals or hot stones and inhaled the vapor or smoke to treat nervous ailments, rheumatism, and colds. They also used balsam fir in sweat baths used for ceremonial, cleansing, or medicinal reasons. And that's why I'm showing this slide. This is a sweat lodge of the Kiowa people on the plains. So the Kiowas and many other people used firs and closely related species for purification rituals in sweat houses, sometimes placing branches directly on hot rocks. And just like a sauna, the steam and smoke persisted within these small enclosed lodges. And think about Seeberger Cave in this regard. It would be akin to a sweat lodge, the central fireplace allowing steam and smoke to permeate the cave, especially if the inhabitants covered the entrance and that rear crevice. Caves are special places. They can be good for everyday living, especially a site like this, a large south-facing cave near a river in a productive forest with plenty of deer and other resources. But in native religions and cosmologies, caves are also places of origin or emergence into this world, portals to spirit worlds, and sacred places for fasting and vision quests. In eastern Iowa, caves might have been especially appropriate sites for rituals involving balsam fir because of the association between balsam fir and caves at algific slopes. The algific slopes are essentially crevices, caves. Balsam fir's healing and sacred properties, as well as its restricted natural occurrence at algific fissures, would have made it an ideal medium for purification and other rituals in caves. So that's that's the balsam fir story, but there might be more to the story of ritual activity in the cave. First, remember the bison, the fetal or newborn cranium. It might simply reflect the fortuitous result of a spring season hunt, but bison calves and skulls play important roles in belief systems and healing rituals among many Native American groups. Look at what's at the entrance of this sweat lodge, the bison skull. Now also human remains, I haven't even mentioned human remains yet, but Nesbitt found the scattered remains of one adult and one late-term fetal or newborn infant. So human interments are common in eastern Iowa caves. They also probably reflected or imbued sacred meaning to the caves. Portal to the spirit world. And so both the fetal or newborn bison, the fetal or newborn human, might be poignant indicators of sacred connections to the spirit world, especially in a cave. So stepping back for a few minutes, what have we learned? Was this examination of Jackson County's first organized archaeological dig, or semi-organized archaeological dig, was it worthwhile? Was it worthwhile for the site to have been dug in the first place? These days, excavation of a cave like this would require a multi-year commitment, a team of experts, large crews of students, paid diggers or volunteers, high-tech mapping and recording equipment, and a six-figure budget. Excavation might not occur at all if the cave is protected or if it's determined to be a burial site. If you think there's a burial in there, don't dig. It's against the law. It's simple as that. And this is for good reason. Most of our energy should be focused on endangered sites or neglected collections rather than damaging an otherwise untouched site. A few other important lessons we might learn from Seeberger Cave. First, it's a lot easier and cheaper to study an old collection than to excavate a new site. In fact, I think it's our obligation as archaeologists to do so, because otherwise, what's the point of caring for those collections in the first place? It takes a lot of space, takes a lot of time, expertise, even money to properly house a collection. What's the point of doing that unless we use it? Another thing we've learned is now we have a lot more information about how ancient people used caves in eastern Iowa, especially this ritual angle. This is something people have conjectured about on and off, but I think for the first time we have some fairly solid evidence that certain types of purification or healing or related rituals might have been going on in a cave, that it might have been used as a sweat lodge, something like that. So we've also, I think this is also another worthwhile thing that we've done, we've brought back to life, to an extent, some previously neglected characters of Midwestern archaeology. Frank Ellis, who I think deserves a little more attention, and George Colley and Paul Nesbitt. These three guys were helping to create modern archaeology 100 years ago, and both amateur and professional archaeology. And I think it's worthwhile to shine a light on them. Now, finally, I guess this is my final slide. Finally, I think we understand more clearly than before that ancient life in this area involved interactions between people and both their natural world and their spiritual world. The natural world, well, we distinguish those things today. We distinguish between domestic life and nature over here, and ritual or ceremonial or spiritual life over there. Most of us don't live in churches or synagogues or mosques. But for the residents of Seeberger Cave, religious ritual probably permeated daily life. There was no real difference. If you're hunting and processing a deer, you're also doing religious ritual. You're praying. You're giving sustenance to your people, and you're thanking the spirits for that sustenance. Families use the cave for everyday activities, but also for healing, purification, and connecting with the spirit world. Burying an infant in the cave, burying a young bison in the cave, connecting to the spirit world. So, what have we done? We've humanized the people who have lived there, or we've tried to do that anyway. Archaeology is mostly about science. It's about shards, stone tools, recording things accurately. But if we don't humanize the people, I think we lose a big part of what makes it interesting in the first place. And maybe that's the most important lesson of Seeberger Cave. And I hope that you might have that same sense as well. And I hope that Frank Ellis and George Colley and Paul Nesbitt would have had that sense also. I hope they would have appreciated those interpretations and conclusions. And I think with that, as I said, I promised I would take any questions and try to answer anything, any issues or questions you might have. Thank you. And I apologize again for not being able to show you pictures of the actual artifacts, but like I said, they're really no different from what's in the display cases with me. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question about Paul Nesbitt, and from what you're describing, he was somewhat irresponsible. Was it because his mentor didn't explain things to him well enough, or?
Yeah. Maybe I was asking you to read between the lines a little too much. Alonzo Pond, who was told to train Nesbitt, didn't want to spend any more time here than necessary. And it's not that he had anything against Jackson County. He was getting married soon. He was going back to France and Africa, which is where he really wanted to work. And I said he didn't have anything against Jackson County. He did not have any use for North American archaeology in general. He was interested in the origins of humanity, which did not occur in North America. He wanted to get back overseas as soon as possible. So he gave Nesbitt just the bare minimum training and then went on his way. Now, did Nesbitt hold that against him in later life? I don't know. And did Pond hold it against Nesbitt that Nesbitt became director of the museum instead of Pond? Okay? Pond was heading for a PhD, but the Depression hit and he had to go to work. Nesbitt married into money and was able to stay in graduate school through the Depression, got his PhD, became director of the museum, and Pond was out scratching for a living. Oh, sad story. But wait. Nesbitt, when he was at Maxwell Air Force Base running the Air Force Tropic Information Center, the intelligence office, hired Pond because he knew Pond was an expert in desert survival, having spent so much time in Algeria. So, kind of a happy ending for both of them. Nesbitt was running a successful Air Force intelligence office. Pond was gainfully employed in using his skills in survival methods. He and Nesbitt ended up writing a book for the Army, for the military, on survival methods. So, happy ending. That was more than you asked, but
No, that was fantastic.
yes.
Could you take a guess at what that original artifact was that you showed that had A?
Oh,
on
yeah,
it or
sure.
something?
Sure. All right. Sherd. It's a pottery sherd. It really is only about the size of maybe a silver dollar. Those are centimeters on the scale there. So that whole scale is only about an inch, 2 inches. Okay. And so what this is part of the, this is the outer surface of a jar, a little bit down from the rim of the jar, near the shoulder. And you can see where the A2 is, it's kind of a smooth clay, and you see all those tiny little bumps? Those are the grit particles that was mixed in with the clay to hold the pot together when it was being fired. And then there's those rows of decorations. Those are made by a very finely carved wooden paddle or a bone tool or a shell, something that had all those little notches carved in it. And before the pot was fired, when the paste was still somewhat moist, this was pressed into the surface of the pot all the way around the pot. Okay? And then down below that, maybe you can see there's even a couple more indentations. And those were made by a different type of carved paddle or a carved stick. And those decorations also went all the way around the pot. Unfortunately, those went so deep that it weakened the pot, and it broke along that row of what we call punctates into the pot. So, it may not tell you a whole lot necessarily. It tells me a ton, because those styles of decorations were only made for what I consider a very short period of time. Only about 200 or 300 years. And, you know, for a Midwestern archaeologist, 200 or 300 years is nothing. So that allows us to say, yes, people of the woodland period, approximately 400 AD, were living here. This type of pottery is found, basically from like southwestern Wisconsin down into southeastern Iowa. A very distinctive type of pottery. And we could even do more scientific tests. We could use chemical analysis to identify the clay and the rock particles in it. In fact, this is what Chad Heinzel and his students are doing at UNI now. Really understanding not only how the pot was made, but what were the sources of the clay and the other material for it. So, yeah, there are only 300 and some crummy little pieces of pottery found, but each one tells potentially a very interesting story. So, thank you for asking.
Was that local then? Was that local clay?
This was, yes, probably. And, you know, we can't say for sure until we do chemical analysis and look at it very closely under a special microscope, but probably made locally. Now, some of the caves and rock shelters in the area, and you can see the Mouse Hollow rock shelter, which is on one of the big poster boards there, has a style of pottery. They found pottery that was probably not made in this area, but was made maybe closer to the St. Louis area. And that's based on the type of clay, the type of paste, the type of temper, you know, the shell, and the type of design. They all scream St. Louis, 1100 AD. But so these are I guess the best way to think about these is working hypotheses. We hypothesize, we think that because this pottery looks like other pottery that has been accurately dated, then we think by comparison, it's like when you see a car zooming down the street and you say, wow, the tail fins on that look just like a '68 Cadillac. Well, you might be right, or maybe it's a '67, or something like that. So styles change, and if you get a good look at the closer you take a look, then the closer you can pin something down in time. Hope that helps. Yes?
So, do we know anything about other technology? Like, how did they fire those pots? They wouldn't have had kilns. And also, did they have bow and arrow and atlatls and that type of thing?
Yeah. These were probably fired in an open firing rather than a kiln. If you can picture the way, Pueblo people today in the Southwest, the way they fire their pots, it might have been somewhat similar. You create a space where you can have, depending on if you want a lot of smoke or not a lot of smoke, you can cover it with various things. You heat multiple pots at the same time. Heat them up slowly, cool them down slowly. It takes 2 or 3 days overall. You do it in the summer probably, so the pots dry out better. But it's been almost impossible in the Midwest to find an ancient pottery firing location because it was all done on the surface. Like I said, there are no prepared kilns or anything like that. Now you mentioned the point styles. I'm glad you asked about that. Until about 600 AD, everyone was using the atlatl, the spear thrower, or javelins, darts, spears. The bow and arrow came in around that time and pretty much revolutionized everything. You start getting small projectile points to fit on arrows instead of those big ones that went on darts and spears. And the style of hunting changed. People were hunting in many different parts of the landscape that it was a little more difficult before. If you're carrying a big atlatl kit and spears and everything, you don't necessarily want to carry all those things hundreds of miles from home. It's going to be very difficult to retool if some of those break. But with the bow and arrow, you can carry a couple whole quivers of arrows with you, and no big deal. And so you can go over a much greater area of landscape if you're a bow hunter than if you're a spear hunter. Anyone vouch for that?
So the people that lived here came in seasonally and hunted an area and left when it got cold?
That's a real good question. Were they here seasonally or permanently?
And were they like villages, or were they independent locations of clans? Is there any evidence to show early civilization around here?
Yeah, it changed a lot over time. Generally speaking, the big permanent villages come in fairly late in time when people started farming. So that'd be between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. And when I say farming, I don't mean corn, beans. I mean knotweed and goosefoot and maygrass and little barley and marsh elder, all crops that are now extinct, basically. So when you start farming like that, you need to have a larger population more at hand. You get more permanent villages, things like that. And those tended to be in the larger river valleys, as a rule of thumb. But these cave locations and other places in the smaller valleys, they were really important too. Not necessarily for full-time, year-round occupation, but for seasonal occupation, for deer hunting, or for hunkering down in the winter when you didn't want to be out in the Mississippi Valley floodplain in the midst of a blizzard. So the entire landscape was used in one way or another. I don't know if that answers your question.
So would these people be like traveling families that came in you know, the oral story is you can get good meat here in June. And then they come in and set up shop and do their thing and then move on.
Pretty much, but it was not, I don't think you mean to make it sound random, because it was not random at all.
Were the woodland Indians, what stage, excuse me, the ones that were in Iowa and around here, is there any evidence of what stage they were at in terms of development from an individual family to a clan to a group? Is there any evidence of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't know how long Native societies divided themselves into clans. It might go back thousands of years. It might only go back to the beginnings of agriculture, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. But these people had territories. Some of them were family hunting territories, some of them were village territories, some of them definitely were clan territories. And the fact that people, I mean, people have lived here ever since the Ice Age, okay, 13,000 years ago.
Here.
Yeah, you can find 13,000-year-old artifacts here. So that's what makes it really hard to generalize, because there were many different ways of organizing society over those years. And there were some experiments, and sometimes experiments didn't last, and sometimes they did.
Were the woodlands the first culture that was identified around here?
Well, there are these arbitrary names that archaeologists have given to the different native cultures. We call the earliest ones in this area Paleo-Indian, because remember, paleo just means old. You know, like Paleolithic. And then there's a very long period of time we call the Archaic period. There's no good reason for that. It's just a name that was used 100 years ago and it stuck. And then the Woodland period, again, why? Because people lived in the woodlands. There's no real reason for that name.
Who followed them?
Yeah, and so that was more recent. And then after that, there were cultures that we call Mississippian because they were focused on the Mississippi River Valley, or Oneota because they were focused on the upper Iowa River Valley, which used to be called the Oneota Valley. But like I said, these are all arbitrary names. We don't know what the Native people called their own cultures in the ancient past, although we have some clues, which we can talk about in detail.
So do we have evidence that we named them, but they didn't see themselves as discrete cultures, that they just merged, and that there was migration in either direction so that people started to mix?
I think there was both. I think there was a very distinct sense of identity. You know, there's us, or my family group, my clan, my village, and then the others. But there was also always a lot of movement and a lot of mixing, a lot of trade. Exactly. I mean, people knew this continent. They had mental maps of this continent based on years of experience and oral traditions, stories. You know, so a person could be living here in what's now Jackson County and be very familiar with what was going on in St. Louis or La Crosse or all of these areas without necessarily having to go there. And they probably knew people who had gone back and forth. But there was a lot of contact, there was a lot of communication, but there was also this sense of identity. Like, for example, the decoration on that pot, you know, that's a message. If you took that, even that little piece, if you took that message down to St. Louis, people would say, oh, you're from way up there. Yeah, okay.
So have you found like souvenir editions of pots and things that show the wide, like the blue clay in southern Minnesota? Has any of that been found around here, or is this too early for them?
Well, that pot I mentioned from the Mouse Hollow rock shelter, there's a picture of it on that poster there. That's probably from the St. Louis area. Some of the little stone scrapers, if you can imagine little hide scrapers made out of stone, some of those at Seeberger Cave were made out of a type of rock that only occurs in southern Minnesota. So people would have brought that down or traded for it. Yep, so there was a lot of communication. Yes?
That rock you mentioned that here in southern Minnesota, did that happen to be pipestone or something like it?
No, I don't think we found any pipestone. Dirk, do you know if any pipestones were found in Jackson County?
Pipestones ever been found in Jackson County.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about is a type of rock called Grand Meadow Chert. And where is this? It's sort of near between Austin and Rochester, I think. And it's a big, big quarry. Chert is flint, essentially. It's a big flint quarry in southern Minnesota, with very high quality material. And this bunch of hide scrapers, one way or another, came down here from there. Yes.
I have 3 stones with me that are from Jackson County, but they've never been identified. Could you look at them and see what your opinion could be?
We can look at them afterward,
Okay,
and we'll have the
okay.
lights on, and you
All
can
right.
bring them up to the table. We'll give a shot. We've got some experts here who can help too. Yes.
I'm just curious what the state of archaeology is in terms of, are there lots of people interested, younger people interested in archaeology and going to school for it? Or is it a time when there isn't as much interest, or?
All right. Up until last year, there was a huge demand for archaeologists. There were more opportunities and more positions for archaeologists than at any time in history. The reason for that is that about 90% of all the archaeologists in North America do this work as consultants, or they do it under contract for different agencies, federal agencies, state agencies, and there's a huge industry, mostly private sector, but also a lot of government agencies and museums are involved in archaeology. A lot of environmental assessments involve archaeology. Some of the most amazing finds of the past, I don't know, 20, 30 years or so have been made because of this consulting business in archaeology. Now, over the past year, a lot of those opportunities are a little more in question. There have been a lot of cutbacks in regulations and agencies and rules, and everything is kind of up in the air these days. Now, as far as academic archaeology goes, there's an interest, but as to whether that translates into people pursuing it for a career, it all depends on how they assess their job prospects after college. Because at the very least, to be a professional archaeologist, you have to have a master's degree. All right? Investing in at least 6 years of college. Are you willing to do that if you're not really sure that you're going to be able to make a living doing it afterwards? So, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I think that's where we're at now.
That's right. I run a consulting business in Albany, New York. And me and my colleagues are very worried about the political climate right now. I think we all know why. I stopped at Effigy Mounds and it's closed. Enough said.
Yes, sir.
The rock shelters tend to be fairly shallow little areas. Is there any evidence of early man being in the caves, like the Dakota caves, or other deeper residences than what we're looking at down here?
Well, the oldest human-made artifact that I'm aware of that's come from a rock shelter in eastern Iowa goes back about 9,000 years to what we call the early Archaic period. So far as I know, there's no evidence that's been excavated from any cave or rock shelter of use during what we call the Paleo-Indian period at the Ice Age. All of the Paleo-Indian finds, all of those 13,000-year-old artifacts might seem surprising, they've been found on the surface of the ground or in stream beds. So we know they were here, but we don't know if they were using caves or rock shelters. Yes, sir.
Could you speak real quickly about what you think his like excavation technique was? Was he just scraping wall to wall
Okay.
all the way back and screening? Or what was he doing?
Okay, well, actually, what I was talking about today was recently published in this journal. And there's an appendix to the journal here that's titled something like Beloit College Excavation Techniques in the 1920s. And so basically what they did, and this is what Pond, I think, instructed Nesbitt to do. Dig a trench. Start outside the shelter, or the cave. Dig a trench, maybe 3 feet, 5 feet wide, perpendicular to that opening, all the way to the back wall. And then chunk everything out, and then look at the walls. And if you see any layers, then do more digging according to those layers. Okay? I think Nesbitt kind of did that. But, like I said, he didn't really record anything of what he found, except luckily for that one fireplace feature with the charcoal. So does that get what you're asking?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. These days,
I had the idea of like 2 to 3 feet, kind of all over the place, and just kind of. But yeah, that's more like what I think of like Albany Mounds, like what they were doing.
Oh,
Right through the
right,
wall.
cutting, yeah. Now, he stopped at about 30 inches, 32 inches, where he encountered what he called clay, very stiff clay. And he asked Colley, his mentor, well, what should I do? And Colley said, well, do some digging, try to get through that clay to see if there's anything really old down there. And there's no evidence that Nesbitt actually did that. Okay? So what he might have encountered was a layer that was just too hard to dig through, and there might have been even earlier material down below that. Have you encountered similar things in the rock shelters?
I'm sorry?
Like a layer of clay that you just decide, all right, that's as deep as we're going to test?
Yeah, the thing with rock shelters, in my experience, is like massive refrigerator-sized rock fall below, you know, that keeps you from exploring below those levels where you would find the Paleo-Indian. I personally think that Paleo-Indian stuff's down there, but it's so deep and hard to get to.
Yeah, when we were out there 2 years ago, we were using a probe, a soil probe, to try to get an idea of what that floor deposit looked like. And within just a few inches, everywhere we just hit rock. So we got to give Nesbitt credit at least for you know, chunking through some of that rock and finding what he did find.
Yeah, got an idea. One man with, you know, just a shovel and a summer's not going to get very far. So.
Right. I mean, he said he had occasional help, but no, it was mostly a one-man job. Any other questions? Yes?
Our hearing isn't very good, so you might have already answered this question. On this site, there weren't any field notes, but I was wondering, is there any evidence that the site was repeatedly used as a sweat lodge?
Oh, good question. That one fireplace might have been repeatedly used. It might have been cleaned out and then reused, cleaned out and reused. That's how sweats are normally done. He found 2 other small fireplaces, but didn't keep any of the charcoal from them, so we don't know if those involve balsam fir or not. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, was this ritual, religious use just a short-term thing, or long-term? Yeah, we really don't know. And was the balsam fir ritual happening at the same time as that bison skull was there? Well, that's one thing we could test, because we could get a carbon date on that skull. We haven't done that yet, but that's a possibility. Was that ritual happening at the same time that that infant child was buried? We don't know, and we'll never know, because those remains have been reburied. So interesting questions, and sometimes my shoulders get tired of shrugging. Anything else? On that uncertain note, thank you.